Hello and welcome to the Pocket Dojo Podcast, the show where we talk about making the world a better place by making better things. I'm Paul Crick.
And I'm Asha.
Today, it's Asha's turn to lead the conversation, so let's dive in.
So today I'm talking with the wonderful Thomas Schindler, a new friend who I always love speaking to. And I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting conversation. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Asha. It feels good to be here, and I'm really, really happy we get to continue our ongoing conversation in this format today.
Fantastic. So Thomas, from that conversation that we started probably only about 6 months ago, really, it feels like forever actually. But from that conversation, I know you're a man of many talents and many stories. So rather than me trying to kind of do that justice in a couple of sentences, what would you like to share of yourself just to begin our conversation today? Something about yourself and something about the work that you're doing that's important to you.
Well, thank you. So, when I think about what to share about myself, that might be useful for a listener, I would say I like starting with how I was configured by life in a way. So my deep configuration starts, I think when I was 5, 7 years old. My parents were continuously talking about two things around the dinner table. One was existential threat to our species, which is a weird thing to talk about when you're 5.
Great.
And the other one was how can we mitigate those risks with natural sciences, because both of them were natural scientists. But there was a conflict in that, because by the age of 7, I was very clear what I was going to be when I grow up. These moments when the teacher at school asks everybody, "What are you going to be when you're big?" Well, I knew exactly what that was, and I also knew exactly what the response was going to be. So I said, "I'm not sharing this." And so the teacher ran after me after school, and she tried to really convince me to tell her. And I said, "Well, I'm going to be a rock star." So, well, I directed that energy, which I never had the courage to really see through, into other forms. So it's definitely that energy that channeled in different ways might have gotten me onto a stage at one point. But that's all, in a natural science household, worried about existential threat and wanting to be a rock star, that doesn't really match. So there's a tension in that, and that tension basically created me. That's what I find useful in understanding maybe the way I think about things, right? Both from an artistic lens, but also from the lens of a natural science first principles thinking. Yeah. So
beautiful. I love it. And I can really see why you and I connect, in that space between that. So tell us a little bit about your work. I know you are involved in many things, and I'd love to just share a little bit about, what those are, and then we'll think about regeneration and what that means for you and what you're doing.
Yeah. So at the foundational level, with my business partner Thomas and we have built a software engineering company about 11 years ago, as a resource bed, a resource foundation, so that we can do the things we believe that need to be done in the world, but without having to ask for money all the time. So this software company is investing the vast majority of its profits into, so I'm talking 80 and 90% of our profits go into trying to contribute. The reason why we built a software company is because basically that's what both of us know how to do. We've both been doing this for 25 years, so that works, and it's been quite successful since 11 years. So that's good. On the top, there's a large vision and hope for a way we organize ourselves as civilization, and we call that the heliogenic civilization.
Mm.
And in a nutshell, we say, instead of putting GDP at the center, let's put life at the center of things. Let's look at how life has been running itself for the last couple of billion years, which is using the 172,000 terawatt from the big fusion reactor in the sky. That's 10,000 times what we have available to us as a civilization right now. And let's use that in the same way the most successful economy on this planet, called nature, has been doing this. And it's doing this by continuously regenerating the same 6 atoms of life. 96% of all life consists of 6 atoms only. And if your body is able to produce teeth and eyes and run on electricity and have bones, then it's not that hard to imagine that we can satisfy the entire material stack for a successful global civilization based on natural principles. And so that's the vision, and that has many, many components that we could talk about for hours and hours. But and towards that, we're building 5 initiatives that are 4 of which are strictly non-profit, and one of them, by its nature, unfortunately, cannot be non-profit, but we're aiming it to be as non-profit as humanly possible.
Sure.
And yeah, so going into all of this takes a while. So I'm just going to describe how we think about them, right?
Right.
So the trajectory from the current modality of how we do things as a civilization into what we call the heliogenic civilization has 2 pillars, really, from our perspective. One is coordination, meaning what if, just picking a number, 98% of global population who don't have access to any meaningful resources got together to remind us, each other, us all, of the fact that even if we run out of money, life doesn't end, right?
Sure.
So if we coordinate, we can continue thriving, or we can begin thriving in a completely different modality. And that's a question of coordination. So coordination is a central part. And then materiality. Like I said earlier, how can we actually grow the entire material stack instead of extracting it? And all 5 activities, initiatives, are touching one or both of these 2 components.
I love the way that you're thinking about that, actually, because that kind of cuts through a lot of the noise and the stories that we all hold. Quite frankly, at the end of the day, we've inherited them, and they're often hard to leave behind. About how we might do that without it being mandated or forced or anything else on us. So I'd love to actually go in a slightly different direction to what we talked about and talk more about that coordination and what that looks like in practice. So yeah, I'm going to phrase it in my own words, and please correct me if that's not right, if I haven't understood something. But what I'm hearing in what you just said, Thomas, is that we can grow things by living principles, so the active aspect of materiality that you touched on, but it's the coordination part where I think we really get stuck. So yes, 98% of the world doesn't have resources, and I'm going to throw another thing in which is important to me, and I'm actually experiencing myself, as we were talking about earlier, is that the middle class is disappearing. So, what has kept us in the illusion of relative security and stability for decades without having to go back into that war cycle that has characterized the economy and how we think about it, whatever, for centuries now. Without doing that, because then obviously we don't have anything left to extract from anyway. How can we actually do that in practice? So, there are many of us thinking about this, doing this, trying to do this, and finding that, the resources that at least we think we need, maybe we need to get past that idea, but the resources we think we need are locked up in that 2% of the population, or even less, quite frankly, who do have them. and the rest of us are finding things harder and harder, being exacerbated by algorithms. I can go into some of my own experience if that feels useful. But so going back to the idea of coordination and linking it to what we planned, which was, about regeneration, and what does that look like in practice? How can we do that in practice when we have very different values, different contexts? How do we bring, let's say, the materiality, the living principles aspects into how we coordinate? What's working for what you're doing?
So I think there are two elements that come to mind as the most important. And then again, materiality, which we can then go into
Yeah,
maybe.
sure.
But the first one really begins with an exploration I did about 10 years ago when it became pretty evident to me that one very possible future was one in which machines become stronger and better at everything humans could do. And I mean everything. I mean, consciousness and feeling is substrate independent. It doesn't need
Body.
wet biology, right? It can run on anything. And so I spent a year trying to figure out what is the difference between us and machines in that scenario. And I was looking for something positive, and I couldn't find anything. And towards the end of the year, I got really frustrated about it and decided, okay, let me look for anything. I wanted to have one thing at least that could differentiate us. And then I found one. And that thing is vulnerability. So a machine can just put on a new arm if it's broken. A machine can go back to yesterday's data state if it's depressed. If it can't figure something out, it just patches the software. So if the body, mind, or soul is broken, for a machine it's easy to fix. For a human, it's hard to impossible to fix. In all three cases. And the best technology that we have to do that healing work that then needs to happen if we're wounded is love. Love, including the caring for one another, right? Mutuality, reciprocity. And so building on that, I found through something I've been doing for the last couple of years as a more and more as a hobby, but I found out that people know that, and the way people know that is, or the way they found this out was a couple of years ago. I was sufficiently embarrassed about the fact that I didn't know a proper answer to the question, what does a better or a good world look like? And so I sat down to write a book or to write an essay or something, to do that. Not to put it out in the world, but just to make sure that I understand that I have a picture. So, and to do that, I wanted to have a framework that helped me guide through this. And I had a bunch of frameworks, SDGs, and all of these, and I measured them against each other, compared them by a couple of questions that I'd developed. And that Jim Rutt, who you also know, helped me refine a lot.
Right.
And so these questions then turned into a serious game that I've played with hundreds of people all over the planet, which helps us to describe the world we would like to live in. Not the world that's possible, not the world, whatever, the world we would like to live in. And this aspect of being in coherence and in harmony, love with other people is essential. So usually how people describe it, say, I want to live in a small group of people. So I'm hearing Dunbar, 150 to 4,500, embedded in nature and in harmony with all of that. And then it's placed basically, and I synthesize that out of that conversation or description. They place it on a matrix between no tech and high tech on the one axis, and let's say Victorian monogamous values and Californian polyamorous values on the other axis, right? And
The scales
somewhere
are
everybody feels a home there,
Right.
finds a home there.
Mm.
So we all carry that. We all know that.
Sure.
And then the second aspect I would like to add is something I learned from Bernard Lietaer. Bernard Lietaer was head of the central bank of Belgium before he was the architect of the introduction for the euro. And I met him in 2003, where he was together with the head of the central bank in Germany, trying to establish a currency somewhere in Germany. And I couldn't understand how that worked, how two high finance dudes could just invent a currency out of thin air. And Bernard explained to me that that always happens like that, that all currencies invented out of thin air, and went on to teach me everything I know about money. And there's a very, very interesting conclusion that he reaches that I only really started to grok once I tapped into materials. But the way he led there was by describing a story, an event really, in the city of Ghent in Belgium. So there was a part of town that had a downward spiral, meaning substance abuse, violence, desolation, all of it. And because the people in that part of town couldn't work because they were undocumented. And nobody could find a solution to this. So somehow Bernard got involved and was asked by the government whether he had an idea. And his idea was to go and ask the people, what's your dream? And it turned out that the people wanted to have a little piece of land so they could grow something. And so he secured a piece of land from the city. He made it accessible to the people through a specific currency that you could only earn by doing things that made the environment nicer. So cleaning the street, cleaning the house, putting flowers in the windows, being nice to each other, all of that would earn you currency that would then give you access to your dream. And for Bernard, that extrapolated into something much, much bigger, which was, what if we had a central bank of dreams where you, for example, deposit your dream, and then some other human, happens to do something that makes your dream bigger, meaning increases the backing of your dream.
But your dream can happen. Yeah, absolutely.
So now you can create Asha token and give me a token of appreciation for the thing I've done, maybe even not knowing that I've increased your dream, right? And then can I buy bread with that token? No, probably not, right? There's a limited amount of Asha tokens all over the globe, because all those people help you create your dream, fulfill your dream. But do I need token to get bread? No, because somewhere among the 1,000 people around me, there's somebody who's really loving to make bread, right? And you can maybe impart anything apart from cleaning the toilet. I'm pretty sure there's somebody passionate about this, and that's
hopefully.
But what you bump into is materiality, right? Where do you get the material? For example, if everybody wants a house, well, I'm sure there are people loving to design houses for free if they have all of their basic needs and wants met, and even building them, because that can also be very fulfilling work, especially if you do it as a community. But where does the material come from, right? And that's why materiality is such an important piece. So
absolutely, yeah, go on.
Yeah, that's how I would see the two elements of coordination, reminding ourselves of the deepest humanness that we can carry inside of us, and understanding that that is carried by everyone, and very consciously, agentically structure incentive mechanisms that help us foster exactly that thing.
Oh, that's wonderful. I want to, if you are happy to go in this direction, I'd like to just probe some of that thinking a bit more, so I can understand it a bit better now. Because there are a few sort of alarm bells is too strong a phrase, but something is kind of going in my system going, hang on a minute. So I love, and I think there are, a number of, we both know the number of communities who are trying to live in that way. And decide their own values on which their means of exchange are based, and create tokens for that or whatever it was. I think that's as a practice, let's say, that's already quite developed in certain parts of the world and communities, as you say, kind of maybe on certain elements of the scales that you described earlier. But when we do that at large scale, so if we wanted to, dream into what can be an alternative to globalized late stage capitalism and what have you, that, most of the world is still caught up in one way or another, without it being a war, without it being washed down communism or Blade Runner or whatever. So the extreme ends of the scales that you mentioned. How can we do that? I mean, in a sense, that's like, we don't really have an answer, otherwise we'd be doing it. But I'm curious, to go from that small, as you say, Dunbar to 4,500 or whatever it is. Maybe that's how we need to be living, is in networked, and I've thought this for a long time, and many others as well, in network communities of much smaller groups who are strongly rooted in a bioregional context, and rediscovering the wisdom that our indigenous communities around the world have to some degree kept, and many of us have lost through the generations of so-called progress, etc. But how do we, so I'm jumping around, let me try and make this into a concrete question that you can respond to. So if we go from that, one end of the scale of, okay, let's live in much smaller communities, and we exchange things within the community, and we promote certain values and behaviors through our tokens of exchange that people recognize, it's an abundant system, let's say. And we learn from each other in different communities rather than trying to scale stuff and all things that we know only too well are extractive. How do we get to that from where we are now? So we can choose to step out of business as usual, whatever we want to call it, and either live very simply, or we have lots of capital, or whatever our own situation is, and find people who are on a similar kind of wavelength, who want to live in the same way, and we can become autonomous, decentralized, etc., as we wish. But the majority of the population is not doing that. What? Okay. And we dream into stuff. Yeah, and we can dream into stuff, definitely. You and I have talked about Ikigai before. Really important. Lots of leaders love it. We've done work in that area. Lots of leaders love it, and then go back to business as usual and pull to the results. And it's nigh on impossible to bring that through. So I'm just curious, given that this thinking is so central to your work and your presence in the world, and many others that we know, both of us, what needs to happen next, in your view, Thomas, for this to be taken up more widely, let's say? So that's a beautiful world. And as you say, the ruthless realism points us to very different.
That's true.
And that isn't, we don't have to end up in that way, but much of the world is going in the directions that as you said, you understood years ago, that was not a world in which you want to live, or you want your kids to live, or whatever. But I'm sure most people would agree with that. Most people would say, if we ask them what's really important to you, it might boil down, and maybe you and I talked about this before, 5 or 6 things: a decent place to live, or to belong somewhere, community, love, decent housing, some education that's worth doing, food, etc. Basic stuff. And yet we live in such a different world. So how do we start to get to that more widely? I'm just, through the work that you're doing, I'm not asking you the impossible question, but yeah.
Exactly, that's the huge question.
Yeah.
And
so what's a good next step?
First of all, I would say the first step is to understand that you will likely not experience that in your lifetime. And you will have to come to terms with the fact that all you can do is contribute a piece of a much, much bigger picture
Mm.
that your great, great, great grandchildren might at one point be grateful for, even not knowing that it ever came from you.
Mm.
And I think that's the first point, to acknowledge that.
Mm.
And then to acknowledge the actual radius of your effectiveness, right? It could be that it is relevant for you to care for family and
Mhm.
friends,
Sure.
and that's fine.
Mm.
And somebody else might have some resource, whatever that is. That could be ideas, potential in the form of money, and potential in the form of hardware, whatever, and put that to use and have a slightly bigger radius, right?
Sure.
That's not a a value judgment of
Sure.
it's just be clear about what you can actually do.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think these are the first
Find
elements.
your own agency. Absolutely.
Exactly. And before I go on, I just wanted to clarify two things that you didn't address exactly, but that came up for me while you were
Sure.
talking. One is, when I mean token, I'm not talking about crypto,
Sure.
right? You didn't say that. I just want to make
Yeah.
absolutely
Sure.
clear.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I also, when I say community of that size, I'm not saying intentional community.
Mm.
In fact, there are many, many communities out there already in the world. They're called villages, and they're ready for everybody to go and contribute, right? So
Sure.
just and maybe that is one of the first steps.
Mm.
Finding that community that you, with your agency, can contribute to.
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that might just be the first step.
Mm.
And this can have so many different shapes and forms that it is practically impossible for me to say
Sure.
what
Yeah. Absolutely.
that is in general, but I would say finding that community definitely
Mm.
is relevant. And then, if you usually history or life doesn't work in extremes, so
Mm.
we can imagine two future scenarios in the extreme. So one is that super positive attractive basin, the heliogenic civilization is full flourishing, or however you want to describe this. There are many forms of describing this. And then on the other end, there's basically extinction, because temperatures just went too high for a day and everybody and the electricity went out and everybody died. The reality will be somewhere in the middle, but in both of these directionalities, being in community and close to land seems to be the best choice. And so proactively moving into a community close to the land and starting to care for land and people definitely is your number one. And I'm saying number one because that's something all of us can do. And beyond that, there's definitely a larger radius that some of us have the capacity to address, and then we go there.
Yeah.
So that would be the very, very first response to that huge question.
Yeah, thank you. It's a huge, in a sense, it's a rhetorical question, but it's just, one that obviously forms. Thank you. That feels, just for me personally, really kind of uplifting and reminder that, we all have agency. I know that, and it's the work that I do, but sometimes I forget my own, we all do. And to focus on what is possible for us and to not do it alone, to be in community, whether that's a physical community directly connected to land that, may be part of our agency. It might be possible, let's call it our affordance. It might be possible for us. It might not be. It might be something that we do in the future. And in my family, that's what we're moving towards, but it's not quite the right time to do that. But to really focus, on that, as you say, the sphere of what's possible for you to contribute to. And, trust, I think also I'm going to build on what you said, trust in that the resources do come. You said it's not intentional community, but I'm going to slightly diverge, let's say, and I don't want to live in an intentional community either. I've done it, and there are great things about it, and there are not great things about it, and so, we're all different, and but to come into community with the intention of, we want to operate in the ways that you're talking about. We want to grow materiality in ways that are coherent with nature. And we want to interact with each other and coordinate in ways that are coherent with nature. As we all know, love is our biology. I think it's Bertrand Maturana who said that most clearly. But, we know what it feels like when we love one another and we're in harmony. And that doesn't mean a romantic love. It can be all sorts of love and caring for each other. And we all feel good. The recent years have shown that to us so clearly, if we forget it. So, thank you for that really wise advice. In a sense, you've sort of touched on all the questions that I had left that I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to ask you them anyway. So in bringing these, fantastic ventures to life and seeding them in ways that, can have a positive effect with what you're doing, Thomas, what have some of the challenges been along the way, just for, people who might be on a similar path? I'm sure there'd be many, but
yeah. So if we call this systems change work, right? And it's such a grand word, and I just want to be very, very clear that neither me or none of my collaborators intend to have the answer
sure.
in that, but with our contributions, we're clearly trying to point towards a future that is more a gift-based relational economy, in which we have material abundance, and that is a world that stands in extremely stark contrast to today's configuration. Now, we do live in today's configuration, and this also means that we need to somehow tap into some of the ways the current situation works. And since there is no material abundance yet, people need often money to be able to get what they need and want for a thriving life. So if we need people to join us, and those people are there, they want to join us, we also need money, right? But it is very obvious that money will not do what money usually is supposed to do, which is return itself and create more in the process.
Absolutely.
And so having access to resource in general, because we've abstracted away into money, and general resource access for everybody is not easy. So that is probably the hardest thing. I used to think that the hardest thing is to help people understand, to work through systems, all of that. That's actually not the hardest thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if there are methods to cut through the noise, to cut into the soul, and I say that with a thought in mind, which is I had a conversation with my mother as she was dying about insights she's had across her life, and there was one around the interconnectedness of body, mind, and soul. And I asked her, what's the soul for you? And she said, well, the soul is for feeling what the mind is for thought. And if I use that as a definition for the soul, and I remember what Daniel Kahneman and others have told us about how we make decisions, 95% or so of our decisions all day long come from heuristics expressed as feelings, then the work is soul set shift, not mindset shift, right? And as I said earlier, we know, right? Given the chance to actually find this in ourselves, we know. The Nordic folk high school movement has shown that very effectively. Robert Keegan, developmental psychology, shows that, along with every other developmental psychology academic out there in a different shape or form, but basically they all say the same thing, right? So we have that in us. What we don't have is the resources available that we need to actually do the work. And so that's the hardest part in this. And building streams of resource that you can tap into that are independent. That's why we started the configuration with Delity, with the software company, to have some of that liberty for ourselves. But that only scales to a certain point. Beyond that, you need others to chime in, and there are few. Definitely, there are amazing individuals that are supporting what we do. But compared to what's going on and what's need to be done, it's too little. And I just as a final, I would like to compare this to the real root cause for the situation of mutually assured destruction that we live in, that forces us into a 6-continent supply chain so we don't hurt each other too much, which is the Manhattan Project. Right? A response to the fear that Hitler would be faster at developing the nuclear bomb led to, in today's money, a project with $34 billion to develop the nuclear bomb. And wouldn't it be equivalent today to put a couple of $100 billion into a pool to actually respond to a threat that might even be larger than Hitler with a nuclear bomb, right? And that's a crazy thing to say, but it might just be larger, right? And so is our response proportional to the challenge? Fuck no, right? It is not, by far not. So that's the challenge, and that everybody in the sphere that I'm part of knows that, feels that, and still continues walking. So, yeah.
I love that provocation, actually. Are there philanthropists, who are whatever, out there who can see what we see? And I know there are, because I've had conversations like this in very different places. I'm sure you have, and others that we know, who are not just in need of a return on investment, although that is not yet outside the realm.
Or think about it differently, right?
Yeah, can see that. Yeah, absolutely. Can we start an arms race, if you like, to use that language, on regeneration? Yeah, of course we can, with the right will, etc. To do stuff. But more than let's change that language, because it sets a direction that's perhaps not that useful, but that can really understand and appreciate the value of the approach to coordination that you've described, and others also doing similar, that to create the conditions for life instead of the opposite, and then raise it all to the ground and start all over again. Everybody knows that it's not going to work.
Exactly. Everybody has that sense, but it's really, really hard to know what to do with that potential that you might have in the bank, in your assets. from the perspective of today, to shift them into other forms of potential. And I think the first step towards that is the word I just said, potential. Understand money and assets as a stored potential. It's a battery.
Sure.
We moved potential out of the ground into stored energy in the form of fossil fuels. We moved that through a machinery we call the economy, and we now have stored it in potential energy in the form of money. And the question now is, what can we do with that potential energy? What form should it take? And before it potentially evaporates, because there is a case to be made that if you look at how money is constructed at this point, is that it rests on energy provision. And energy provision is not to be taken for granted.
Sure.
So if energy starts going away, so will the money. And so will the possible potential that we have stored in money right now. So actually, the wisest thing to do, and probably the most economically viable, rational thing to do, is, as you see that we will not solve the energy part of this equation, you have to get rid of all your money as quickly as you can and turn it into other forms, even if they don't return to you.
Yeah, which is, the concept of demurrage and, whatever. That is, I think, is a really valid thing for us to think about.
You can think about it in terms of multiple forms of capital, right? 8 forms of capital. I like Soloviev and Landua, and the interesting thing about that is 3 of the 5 of the 8 are quantifiable: money, material, and maybe living. 5 are non-quantifiable. You can only feel them. You can qualify them. So the measuring system already exists. It's just not objective, right? It's just not objective. And how I feel about something is clear to me, but not to you, and vice versa. So it's subjective and relative. So, and then the one we have among those 8 that we can play with, that is actually up for negotiation while the others aren't, is money, right? And playing with that and shifting it is ultimately going to lead you into a situation where you start asking questions: how can I transform that money into other forms of capital? And the way you can think about this is by asking yourself, what does my ideal life look like? And if you ask, what does my ideal life look like, and then maybe my collective's ideal life, and then maybe humanity's ideal life, but let's start with yourself, and code the inputs you need for this life in those multiple forms of capital, or others you might want to come up with, but you segment it.
Yeah.
You will likely discover that actually you don't need money. What you need are friends, and what you need is community and culture and knowledge and yes, some
things
material
that make us human. Absolutely.
Exactly. And then from my own calculation, I need about 7% financial capital to abstract away some stuff that I cannot get otherwise. But my largest need is cultural capital, 16%, and social capital also around 16%, right? So that's, you can start thinking about it, and then it actually becomes liberating, right? I know a person who has put 20 million of their own money into systems change activities, not expecting any of this back, and saying that the true accounting for this is so incredibly on the positive side. It's immeasurably high. So the 20 million was actually a bargain for what they received in return, right?
which is a wonderful way to bring our conversation, I think, to a close for today. There are so many directions we could go in, to continue it.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we will. Yeah, I look forward to that. But before we do finish, Thomas, I have 5 surprise questions, let's say, which you haven't seen. Will you play? They're fun, but they are also absolutely relevant to what we're saying. So I'd love to see what your answers are. So question number 1, Thomas, one consistent non-negotiable, so in other words, it's something you really, stick to regularly, practice that helps you to stay grounded in the midst of all of this.
I use a technique called, I call it unloading. So I write my stream of consciousness and then I destroy what I've written. That's very, very helpful to have a conversation in absolute deep truth and radicality that nobody will ever know about. It's very liberating.
Wonderful. It's like burning it, isn't it? It's just evaporating into nothing. Okay. Next question feels slightly odd given everything that you shared, but I want to ask you anyway. One thing you'd still like to develop in yourself or change about yourself to have even greater impact than you're having already?
I think patience. I'm never quite sure whether I'm impatient or whether it's a strong case of ADD. But being satisfied with what is here now rather than pushing forwards, maybe something around that. Yes.
I can totally relate to that. Question number 3, someone who's really inspired you, and I'll put question 4 with it. Why?
Oh, so many people.
Choose one.
Well, I'm gonna use. I think I'm gonna use Jim Rutt. And the reason why I want to use Jim is because he is has such a large amplitude in everything he does, meaning he was very successful in what's in his world he calls game A, to after he had an epiphany, followed that and really radically shifted into something completely different on the opposing ends, diametrically opposed. And then when you listen to him, he can come across as this rough dude, right? But actually,
a little bit.
He's like a 14-year-old with overflowing love in his heart, right?
Yes.
And he's such a extremely curious and relentlessly moving forward and playful human being. I would say Jim.
Yeah, cool. That's lovely. That was a great podcast as well. And then last but certainly not least, in a sense you've answered it, but let's just bring it to a close for today. Yeah. So what's your biggest aspiration for the world?
For the world. So aspiration sounds like I'm involved in that. I wanna say hope rather than aspiration.
That's fine.
So my hope is that the world taps into the understanding that everything we need to live a successful, thriving life with all other life on this planet, even in the situation of emerging climate chaos, is possible by tapping into nature and ourselves.
Absolutely.
That is my deep hope. I know it's possible, and my hope is that we manage to move into that direction or into that. Mhm.
And, as you said earlier, that in finding our own agency, we can all do that. We can all tap
Mhm.
into that hope and all the possibility that is within us, our own
Mhm.
potential, call it whatever you like. That is absolutely possible. And if we all did that, and of course that's going to take time and all sorts of stuff,
Mhm.
what an amazing world it could be.
Yes.
And I think that is happening for all the emergence of scenarios that many of us have nightmares about or whatever. I think that's also happening at the same time. It's just
It
that,
is.
going back to what you said about community, finding each other, it's so key. That's been a challenge for me because I don't necessarily want to be in community all the time, at least. But I
Mhm.
think it's such an important part of finding a community that can look very different for different people. And look at what you can do yourself. And
Mhm.
that can make a huge difference, even if it doesn't feel that way.
Mhm.
Thomas Schindler,
Fully.
thank you so
Asha,
much for joining
thank you
us.
so
It was an
much.
absolute pleasure. Please come back again. You and I could talk for hours, weeks, days, whatever, months, and it would be an
Yes,
absolute
yes.
pleasure.
We've done that already twice
Yeah, that's
on the new Woolshan podcast, so I'm happy. Call me in any time. I'm
Will
going
do.
to be here. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for inviting me.
fantastic. It's wonderful.